Lepo pozdravljeni na srečanju Akademije Amnesty, ki bo tokrat v celoti potekalo v angleškem jeziku. So welcome to another of series of seminars of Amnesty Academy course, Human Rights in Practice, that is available to all the students of University of Ljubljana and is hosted here at the Faculty of Social Sciences. I want to mention in the start that the kickoff of the Amnesty Academy is being made possible by the Active Citizens Fund. This is a grant donated by Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. And as you may know, human rights education is the only exception for Amnesty where we do accept money from governments. But for all the other work that Amnesty does, from research, campaigns, media work, advocacy, also strategic litigation, and so on, we do not accept money from the governments, and we rely in total to our membership base and our individual supporters, and this is to maintain our independence. So by now, within Amnesty Academy, we have introduced to you some of the human rights issues that we work on, and all the engagement that and efforts that we do for impact for human rights is connected, is in fact a combination of campaigns, media work, advocacy, and so on. But it all starts with research, with investigation, and reporting of the findings. So verifying and documenting the facts is our foundation, and bringing the attention to these facts to the public, to the government, and sometimes also to the courts is the way we address human rights violations. So today we wanted to present to you the importance and the methodology of our research work with inviting a guest speaker, Donatella Rovera, a researcher and a senior crisis response advisor at Secretariat of Amnesty in London. She is based in London, but she travels and does much of her work with research missions and while staying in countries such as Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Ethiopia, Israel and Palestine, and many others. Donatella is one of many researchers that work for Amnesty, but I have not met or heard of any other that would be researching so many crisis areas and armed conflicts, and that would be so fearless, proactive, and determined in finding her way to be close to the victims in the highest risk situations. Donatella speaks Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, Italian, French, and English, of course. She was born in Italy to Argentinian father and a Romani mother, raised in France and educated in the UK. She studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies of London University, and she was focusing on Middle East politics, international human rights and humanitarian law, refugee law, Sharia law, and international criminal investigations. And on a more personal note, if you ask Donatella what she likes to do just for fun or relaxation, her answer will be, surprisingly or not a hairdresser or a spa, but paragliding or jumping from a tall building. So we may recommend Donatella to come back to Slovenia for paragliding, but maybe less so to find buildings tall enough for jumping. So we are really pleased, we are so happy and proud to have Donatella with us today. And we also feel very lucky that she is with us in person, because we just had this piece of luck then when we were talking and planning for this seminar. Donatella did not yet know that she's traveling next week for another mission, and basically we were lucky to get her time and attention, which is normally in her job, spent on really the gravest human rights situation in the world. So we are really honored and privileged to have you here with us, Donatella, and please welcome Donatella Rovera.
Thank you for your kind words, Natasha, and thank you all for being here. So I work in a small team at the headquarters, which is the crisis response team, and we're the team that tends to deploy to acute situations. The microphone is slightly problematic. It's making... we deploy to situations of crisis, which most often tends to be wars and conflict. generally during the acute phase or immediately after. And my job is to investigate serious human rights abuses, very often war crimes and crimes against humanity in situations of conflict and crisis. So what I will be doing today is to share with you how we do this work, both in the field investigations, but also all the work that we do backstage, so to speak, the remote sensing, verification, geolocation, analysis of satellite imagery, and how the various elements complement each other to enable us to the greatest possible extent to establish the facts. Because facts are really the basis for the advocacy and the campaigning and the communication work that we do, you know, trying to put pressure on the perpetrators and trying to change things. So when talking, so first of all, I should say that there are some graphic images, not too many, hopefully. So when people talk about investigating war crimes, crimes in general, this is the kind of scene that kind of comes to mind. This is the ideal crime scene where the place is secured, i.e. Nobody can interfere with it, and access is possible. Whereas in the way that I and my colleagues work most of the time, that is not what a crime scene looks like for me, but this is more what a crime scene looks like. And this in itself brings a lot of challenges. So some of the challenges of working in this kind of environment, there is something very remarkably similar about you know, what conflict does to people and to places. So one of the first things that is a challenge in this situation is the contamination, the possibility of unexploded ammunitions that cause a danger for us and those that are around us, the people that we talk to, that we interview. But also, in this kind of situation, often communication is either reduced or non-existent. So that limits what we can or cannot do. So arriving in places like Raqqa, trying to find people, I mean, surprisingly, you might think that, you know, a street that looks like this is deserted, but actually families are living in all these buildings, in whatever is left of the buildings. And trying to find people when there is no communication, obviously it's not possible to call people or send them a message. So the only way really is to go door to door. And that's where the problem of avoiding unexploded ordnance is a challenge. And so it's always a question of balancing those two needs. And civilians living in the aftermath of a war or during a war are often not aware of some of the dangers, and notably the dangers from unexploded ordnance. Like, I went to the house of this man in Armenia just after the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and he showed me this rocket that had damaged this house, which was only partly exploded, but, you know, he was keeping it in the living room because he didn't know that, you know, it could be problematic. And of course, the remains of the ammunitions are, you know, pretty much everywhere. In the case of the conflict that happened exactly a year ago between Armenia and Azerbaijan over control of Nagorno-Karabakh, both sides were putting forward a very different narrative. almost a diametrically opposed narrative, as happens often in conflict. And that's why the importance for investigators like us to get to the ground as soon as possible, so that we can find material evidence such as this. So in the case of this particular conflict, for example, both sides used cluster bombs, cluster munitions, which are forbidden under international law. Both sides denied using them, but said the other side was using them. The truth is that the material evidence that we found on the ground was that both sides used cluster bombs and used other indiscriminate weapons that harmed civilians. A common denominator, I should say, in most conflict, and certainly pretty much all the conflicts I've worked on for more than 20 years, is that contrary to what people think, that modern conflicts are all about very new, modern, sophisticated, incredibly precise weapons. The reality on the ground is that whereas those weapons do exist, and some parties to some conflicts do have them, even those who do only use them in the small minority of cases. Most of what I find on the ground in conflicts all over the world where I've worked tend to be much older weapons and ammunitions, which are not so precise, which have a much greater impact radius, and which are therefore much more dangerous for civilians. And these that you've seen on the screen are a good example of that. Why that is the case is simply about, budgetary reason. The older, less precise munitions cost less. They require personnel that can use them, that doesn't have to be trained in the same way as those who operate much more sophisticated, newer types of weapon. So it's that kind of balance of how valued or not is civilian lives in conflicts. The places where myself and my colleagues, or the examples that I'm giving are places where I've worked, can be urban environments or very rural environments that can be very difficult to reach. It can take, to get to this village, took a couple of days travel. Sometimes the investigation has to be split between the places where the survivors and the witnesses are present. Like in this case, in South Sudan, this is a camp for displaced person. So all I can find here is the testimonies that people have. And here is a village in the Central African Republic. When I got to the village, there were no civilians left. So what I could find here is the material evidence of what has happened. In this case, burned down houses, bodies of people who were killed, ammunitions that were used by those who killed people. And so it often has to be a combination of what people can tell us and what we can find in terms of material evidence, combined with what we can find remotely, which I will come to later. Sometimes those two are in the same place, sometimes they are in different places, and they can be in very far places, and that we may have access to the people, but not to the place, or access to the place and not to the people at different time. So I rarely work in the ideal situation where I have access to people, place, material evidence in the time frame that I would like to. But that's just what we have to work to. In terms of the biggest challenges, there are many, but some of the challenges that I face in this work is access or loss of access. So a place may be accessible today, and tomorrow I may want to go back and I can no longer do that because either the parties that control that area change their mind, or the area comes under the control of a different group or a different force that doesn't let us through, or the bombardment become very intense, or some other attacks are underway and it's no longer possible to go. And that's another reason for trying to get to places and get as much work done as possible when it's possible to do it. The development of collective narrative that happens very often in situations of conflicts, where because of trauma, because of many reasons, a narrative develops and people repeat that narrative, which sometimes may be an exaggeration of what happened, or it may be something that didn't happen, but that is what people perceive and what people have heard and what people repeat. At other times, it may be because people are feeling under pressure by parties to the conflict to give a certain narrative. And this leads to false or erroneous testimony, either because people are afraid and therefore they give a certain version, or because they have a political position and they give an ideological position as opposed to a real representation of what happened, or because people perceive reality different. To give you a concrete example, on many occasions, people told me that they were being bombed, whereas actually what was happening was not that their area was being bombed, but that somebody near their home or in their area were launching mortar or artillery attacks against another area. Civilians, especially civilians who are not used to living in a war zone in the earlier stages of the war, because then they become used to the noises, but early on can't make the difference between incoming and outgoing fire. And so they may tell me that something happened, whereas actually something else happened, and is not, you know, they don't do that on purpose, but simply because that's what they think happened. The contamination or removal of material evidence, and again, sometimes it happens on purpose, sometimes it just happens because people move things. In one of my trips to Raqqa in Syria, where I knew that a lot of artillery had been fired, and I wasn't finding as much as I should have found. And then I went to look in scrap yards, the people who buy metal and then melt it and repurpose it. And that I found vast quantities. Basically, people had cleared the artillery shells from their homes and the streets and sold them, A, because they needed to clean, and two, because they needed the money. So, you know, there had been huge removal of evidence, not on purpose, not for any particular reason, but just because, you know, people need to get on with their life. Material evidence is also often destroyed in subsequent strikes, which, you know, destroys a building where there was evidence of a previous crime. Missing paper trails, you know, in situations of wars, the documentation loses priority. So, you know, the certificate, the paper from the police, from the hospitals, you know, people are operating in emergency situation and the paper trail goes missing because it's often just not, you know, they don't fill the paper. The deliberate manipulation of audiovisual material, increasingly important because there is tons of information on social media, but some of it, sometimes a lot of it, is either manipulated or cannot be verified. The risk to security for people, not just for us, but for the people we interact with, and the security of data, which is a huge issue. What I mentioned before, the risk of unexploded ordnance, either left over or newly placed. Mass flight, the fact that people run away in mass and you know, communication is lost. Not everybody is on social media, especially perhaps slightly older people. And online material gets deleted. So, you know, if it hasn't been saved, is lost. So, you know, talking about the paper trail, this is Syria in the early days of the war. And this was kind of like really only in the first year when it was still possible to get some medical certificates. As you can see, it's already, you know, quite sort of raw, handwritten, and then very quickly those stopped being available. So records of people who'd been shot and you know, had their bullets extracted in a hospital were no longer available. For two reasons: because the doctors were too busy, because they were operating in hospitals that were being bombed, and so their priority was caring for the patients rather than filling in the paper records. And thirdly, because it was too dangerous to, you know, note this, because providing medical treatment for victims of shooting or bombardment could then leave the doctor at risk of being arrested and kill themselves. Same for police arrest records. In war, it's not so much the police arresting people, it's, you know, the army, armed group taking people, often in large numbers, and so, you know, no paper record of that either, and people go missing, and there is no record of who took that person in the first place, and the numbers are huge. And you know, back to the risk for the victims and the doctors being identified. So trying to document and trying to keep some records involved, you know, for example, here in this case, you know, I covered the face of the victim. It was important to document the injuries, but it was important not to make sure that neither the place, the hospital itself, nor the doctor, nor the patients were recognizable. So what you can see of the room, you don't see any identifying features so that somebody could recognize that this is a room in that particular hospital. And these are all things that we need to think about, you know, at that moment. Situations where the evidence goes missing. If you look at the building here, this is a demonstration that I photographed in May 2012 in Syria, in a particular district of Aleppo. People in these demonstrations were shot at, some were killed, some were injured. And there was some evidence left in the buildings that you see in the background because live fire was used, so there were bullet impacts on the wall. And that was evidence, but that evidence was destroyed soon afterwards when massive bombardments took out entire neighborhoods. So, you know, those bullet impacts on the wall that constituted evidence, unless, I mean, the only evidence is whatever photographs were taken of those impacts because the buildings were destroyed. And that happens so often in situations of war. So in another parts of Syria, in this room, 9 people were shot, 8 were killed, and 1 was left for dead, in a kind of extrajudicial style killing. And this is the room where it happened, and these are the bullet hole where, you know, people were kneeling on the floor. And this is evidence, but now the only evidence is the photograph because the house was later destroyed in a subsequent bombardment. In this place, there was strong evidence of artillery shelling used against the house, so big holes in the wall. But, you know, the following year, the village was bombarded and the houses that had been previously damaged were completely destroyed or half destroyed. So the walls where there was the impact of the artillery shell was gone. So whatever was available before is now, I mean, whatever photographic or video images were captured, because now, and this is important because if we think about prosecution before a national or an international court, at the very best, it will take years, whether in the country or outside. Usually it happens after the conflict has ended. And so if the material evidence is destroyed, then the next best thing is whatever documentation there is of when the material evidence was available. That's why, again, it's important to go as soon as possible because you don't know when it will be destroyed again. The problem of working in an environment where where the conflict is ongoing, and so munitions are all over the place and fall, during the investigation. So here, this was a cluster bomb attacks in a residential neighborhood, again in Aleppo, in Syria. And what's the danger here? I mean, apart from, being potentially caught in the attack when the bombardment happens, then the problem is that this bomb delivers a lot of these small bombs, and a lot of these small bomblets don't explode on impact, but can explode if you then pick them up later. And so the big challenge when investigating in that situation is that somebody like us arrives, and on the one hand, we may unintentionally hit one of these. You can walk over it in the middle of the rubble. You don't see them. They're quite small. You can see next to the pen. And by the way, the reason for photographing with a pen is to have a sense of scale, because otherwise you don't know how big or small it is. And if you don't have a ruler, you use other thing, a packet of cigarettes or a pen or something. And so it's a danger for us, and it's a danger for people who may want to show us, what has fallen, what has killed their relatives. Other unexploded ordnance that doesn't look like weapons and bombs. So, so this is all kind of homemade devices. This is a cooking pot, and it's been filled with explosive. And for somebody who knows very quickly, for me, what I notice is the wire. A cooking pot that looks like full of salt shouldn't have a wire sticking out. But again, for ordinary civilians that are not used to that kind of situation, they can easily touch it. And here, all of these are improvised explosive devices, kind of like cooking pots, fire extinguisher. Again, you notice that there is a wire sticking out of the fire extinguisher. Jerry cans, there is no wire visible from the jerry can, but all of these are homemade bombs. And they are a danger for us and for the people we interact with. Mass displacement, as I said, people run away, they lose their phone number, their phone doesn't work anymore in the country where they move to, and if they don't have a social media account, you've lost them. And later, when you need to follow up on the case, it becomes impossible to find them. In that respect, social media makes a huge difference, because today, if I meet people in a given war zone and they don't have a social media account, I try to find out whether, does your nephew or your brother, your cousin, or does anybody that have a, Facebook or Instagram account, and often they do, and so that's how you can then trace people later if you can't communicate with them by phone anymore. The issue of the material that gets deleted from social media, it's a huge and controversial issue. There is a lot of information on social media that is either misleading or too graphic or advocating hatred, that portrays violence, and there are good reasons for social media platforms to delete very graphic, violent videos. But those very graphic, violent videos can be very useful for investigators. And sometimes it's it's witnesses who film it, but sometimes it's the perpetrators themselves. So the importance of downloading and saving in a separate, secure location the material that is available on open source is it's very crucial, because you may lose something that's potentially very, very useful. In terms of deploying to the field, the kind of work that goes into that, obviously, we don't go on the spur of the moment, but, we are in contact with people and we research the issues before. We do some very robust risk assessment, set the objectives, because it's not a good idea to just turn up somewhere and say, I'm going to see what's happening. It's, better to maybe leave a day later, but to kind of know what we're going to do. The modus operandi, how we're going to operate in a given place. We usually are a small team, 1 person, 2 people at the most. And we have no security protection of any kind. So it's important that we're very clear on our modus operandi and security protocol. How do we communicate back to the office? If there is no phone coverage, then any tracking app is not going to work. So we need a sat phone with enough batteries to, be able to track our movements so that our colleagues at the office know where we are, so that if we go missing, they know that they need to start looking for us. And when we come back, it's, to do all the, first of all, to have a kind of a clear idea of what we may aim to do with the material that we are able to collect and verify. And when we come back, there is always more work. The work never finishes in the field. We generally need to follow up, on the research and investigation. There are elements of verification, with satellite imagery and et cetera, that tends to be done often after we are back. And then, of course, the whole strategy of what we do with this information in terms of having a clear advocacy strategy for campaigning and the communication strategy to communicate our findings. While we're on the field, mapping is massively important. And mapping doesn't just mean, in this case, there are certain apps that are really good. This is Raqqa, and this is an app that allows me to make notes for every point, so that I can map specific buildings, different locations. And while using that, is also important to be clear as to how we can do that securely, so that the information doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And so the information may be put in a coded way, or in some situation we cannot use this. Good mapping, like if we're operating in a situation like this, north, south, which wall was hit, from which direction was the rocket coming, those are difficult to capture in a photograph or in a video, but a sketch can be useful to kind of like remind us of specific details, when we're back at base. Issues that were visible or near that you cannot capture in a single image. Similarly, when people point to different things as we interview them, interviews rarely take place in the ideal situation where you can be in a quiet place and have your kind of your typical interview setting. It's often in noisy places where people come and go, where the situation is not conducive to do a kind of your typical interview format. The importance of being there for finding material evidence, one aspect of it is specifically to establish what weapons were used, because that often tells us whether the attack was legitimate under the laws of war, international humanitarian law, or whether the attack was unlawful. And the type of weapon that was used for each attack is massively important. It is also important for us because we can tell often who launched the attack by the type of weapon that was used. So this is, for example, is Yemen, and of the parties involved in the conflict, one side had air power and the other side did not. So the party that launched this bomb can only have been the party that has air power, because this type of bomb can only be launched from aircraft. Pieces of munition, even small pieces, this piece is half the size of a packet of cigarettes, can have tremendously important information, codes, numbers, serial number, dates, that tell us who made that weapon. And for us, that is important because in documenting war crimes, the important parties are the ones who launched the attack, but also the ones that provided the means of that attack. So who produced and who sold the weapon to a party that then used that weapon in a manner that was unlawful or potentially unlawful. Here again, another example of very important information found on scraps of weapons found in the field. The ideal situation, of course, is finding either, you know, this or this or this, where immediately you know exactly what it is, all the information is there because so much of it has survived. The reality is that most of the time, this is what I find by digging in the rubble or in the dust. And when I look at all of these pieces, I can tell immediately a couple of pieces. So, you know, fins, which are stabilizing fields for bombs that have been delivered by aircrafts. If I don't know, we have military experts who can tell us by looking at the photograph. And even if I know, these photographs will always be submitted to more than one military expert to double check again and again. Again, the importance of photographing fragments with something that tells us what the size is, because when I see this, I have, you know, this man's feet that gives me a comparison, but when I have this, it's far more accurate because it actually gives me, you know, how many centimeters. The fact that it's a Mickey Mouse ruler, it's the penalty for having forgotten to bring my own from home and having to get one that I, you know, whatever I could get locally. Sometimes the information that is publicized by the companies that make the weapons themselves is very useful in identifying. So what you see here is a brand new version of what you saw in the previous photograph, the stabilizing fin. And so the characteristics are detailed by the company that makes it themselves. Sometimes what you see at first sight is not what it looks like. So this is a bomb, like one that we saw before, delivered by this is in Syria, in Raqqa, delivered by the airplanes of the United States-led coalition. There were a few countries that were bombing, so this was American-made and American-delivered. But here, this has been used by ISIS that was controlling Raqqa at the time, filled with explosive and used as improvised explosive ordnance. The same is true of the mortars that are next to it. And again, important to be able to see that up close and in details to know what side is, what material each side is using. More of the same here. And also to understand the tactics that different armed groups use, where it's not just what was made in the factory, but it's what they make at home. Here, for example, they're using small metal balls to put into mortars to increase the lethal power of it when the explosion occurs. Here, for example, an interesting case in Yemen where a new type of cluster bomb that was produced by an American, very well-known American company, Textron, that was claiming that it was producing ammunition that was not a cluster bomb, that was completely safe. But by being present on the ground, it was possible for us to establish that it had been used in civilian areas, and that it did not have the characteristic that the company was claiming. Clear information as to where it was coming from. results don't come often enough for us in our line of work. In this case, the publicity that we were able to generate, having found this on the ground in Yemen and having the details of how it had been used, created publicity that was not very good for the image of Textron. So within a year, because the previous this munition, I saw it in Yemen in July 2015, and a year later, in September 2016, the company announced that it was stopping the production of this particular type of bomb. And the reason it gave was because the current political environment has made it difficult to obtain approvals, and basically that weapon treaties that negatively affect the ownability of its shares. That is to say that shareholders of Textron, ordinary people who own shares in Textron, did not want to own shares in a company that produces an internationally banned weapon, and that is then used in situations that put civilians at risk and that kill civilians. So, you know, kind of there are sort of real concrete reasons and possible impact. And I now want to turn quickly, because I know that I've already spoken for possibly too long, about the remote side of the investigation, what we do, you know, out of the field, and how that can really complement the work that we do in the field. Again, this is Raqqa. Raqqa is an interesting example because it is the most destroyed city in modern time. 80% of the buildings in the city were destroyed or damaged by the bombardments of the US-led coalition force in the summer of 2017. So when I was on the ground, I was able to document what happened at the street level, to look at the impact, the damage for each building, to talk to the people who had been injured, who had survived, whose relatives were killed. Often people in situations of wars and conflicts are very traumatized, and so they may remember certain details but not others. And so getting a timeline of when different places were bombed was very difficult just from the witnesses. Some people, you know, were giving me a date, and, you know, they were obviously sure that it was that date when their family were killed, when they survived the bombardment. But what proved extremely useful was the satellite imagery, because there were a lot of satellite imagery that were taken at different times throughout the period of the war. And so that could, that would, you know, told us exactly when different places were damaged or destroyed in the bombardment. And that was also an important verification tool against, you know, the testimonies that we were receiving. It also told us about the tactics of the battle, because we could establish a time frame of, you know, how the forces had proceeded from one area to the other. And the impact is very visible. Obviously, this was happening during the summer, and Raqqa is a city where there are very few trees, so satellite imagery delivers information of a very good quality. If it's very clouded, that can obstruct what you can see on satellite. If it's a very wooded area in a forest, again, very obstructed. So again, nothing gives perfection, but they're all tools that can really help. Satellite imagery can also help in situations where we lose access to the territory. This is a place in northern Iraq, and this particular investigation was looking at the destruction of villages by the forces of the Kurdish administration, and the villages that were targeted were Arab villages. So at the beginning, it was possible for me to visit those villages and to see the various stages. So the area where this is occurring was, from east to west, the area south of the Kurdish run areas in northern Iraq. And so in the first stages, places were looted and burned down, and I could have access to those villages. And then in the second stages, it was the sort of destruction, either, by artillery or other means, exploding the houses with explosive devices. And then, the third stage was going in with the bulldozers and flattening the villages. But that's where the local forces stopped giving us access. So this is an exceptional situation where I was able to get access to this particular village. In many other places were no longer possible to document the last stages, but it was possible to do so with satellite imagery that told us exactly when the destruction happened. And so it was possible for us to complete the picture of, the last stage of what happened in the villages where we could no longer go. Geolocation has been massively important in the conflict in Ethiopia that myself and other colleagues have been working on since it started a year ago, because the Ethiopian government does not allow Amnesty International or any other organization to access the country. So we can speak to people in the refugee camps in Eastern Sudan, and we can work with whatever material is available, either on social media or that people film and send us in one way or another. But we need to be able to verify that. So in this particular case, a massacre was committed in Mahiberedego, south of Aksum, in the north of the Tigray region, which is in the north of Ethiopia. And when we first heard about it, it was through a series of video frames that became available last March. We had no idea where it was. We were told it was in Tigray, but what you can see doesn't really tell you very much. But what we were able to do by using various verification tool was, first of all, to geolocate exactly where this is, because there are a lot of different frames, cliffs, mountains, so we were able to geolocate the exact place. And then we were able to see on some of the frames, not just the type of uniform, but the patch on the uniforms of the Ethiopian army. As well as some relatives of men who are seen in these frames who recognize them. And so in this way, we were able to establish what happened. We were also able to establish the time of the day by using tools that analyze the length of the shadows. And in another example, and this is the last one in Cameroon, we were able to establish who killed. There was a woman and 2 children who were killed in cold blood, and the government denied that the people seen in this video are members of their own armed forces. They said, our armed forces do not use those uniforms and do not use those weapons. Some frames are clearer than others. For example, this one of our military experts, and this was confirmed by other military experts, was able to see specific details on the type of weapon used here. And we were able to establish that these were government forces because years earlier, government forces who were being trained were photographed, and the photographs were published by the government of Cameroon themselves about the training of their soldiers. And guess what? They were using this particular type of weapons, and they were using these particular types of uniforms. So again, this was something that we were able to do by verifying information that was available on open sources. this process is often very time-consuming, but can really deliver concrete results in terms of what we can do remotely. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Microphone? Do we have... Oh. Yes, very often. So, for example, just of the conflicts that have happened in recent years, during the conflict in Libya, I spent several months in different parts of Libya, depending on, you know, what was possible to access, but from Benghazi to Misrata, then all the way to Tripoli. So the whole conflict lasted like from February to October in the big bulk, and I was present there most of the time. In Syria, I spent most of 2012 and 13 in Syria, in different parts of Syria, depending on, you know, what was accessible. But, you know, in the Idlib, Raqqa, Aleppo, and Deir ez-Zor areas, when the bombardments were at their most intense. I was then back in Raqqa and around Raqqa in 2017 when the coalition was bombarding, because in the previous years it was Syrian government forces and Russian forces that were bombarding rebel-controlled areas. In Iraq, I was present in 2014 when ISIS took control of Mosul and the Sinjar areas, and in other places. So yes, very often is the case. At other times, it's afterwards. In some cases, it's during and afterwards. And in some places, we cannot go at all, like Ethiopia. So it really depends on a case by case. There is also... So again, it varies. We try to go with the permission of those who control the territory. It may be the government, it may be another party, depending on the situation. Sometimes that is not possible because those who control the territories do not give us access. And when it's physically possible and when it's safe enough for us and for the people that we meet, we can also go without the permission. So initially, when I was going to Syria in 2012, 2013, I was going, so to speak, illegally without the government permission, even though I was also operating in government-controlled areas. In Mosul, for example, I went after ISIS took over, but it very quickly became clear that it was not possible to work because it was too risky, not just for myself, but especially for the people with whom I would interact with, because then I can leave, they can't. So that's always the consideration. It has to be possible and it has to be safe enough for everybody, not just for myself to get in and out, but so as not to put at risk people whom you know I would meet with, and so the answer is that, you know, it again it depends on the situation, and sometimes we may go to a place with the, you know, with the permission from those who control the territory, but then they change their mind and, you know, we can't have access to a certain area, or the opposite may happen where we go to places expecting not to have access to certain areas, and then it becomes possible. It can be very volatile. There was somebody here who had a question. Yeah. Sorry, you need to speak up a bit because I can't hear you.
Do you need protection in order to investigate? Do the groups in the place that you investigate, do they try to cancel the investigation by killing you or so on?
So we do not work with protection. We are an NGO, so our modus operandi is very different, for example, than United Nations. You know, we move in very small units, 1 or 2 people. We don't have a visible car. We just use a normal vehicle, or, you know, so we're not very visible. We do not accept protection or accompaniment by those who control the territory, whether they are government or an armed group, for many reasons. One is because by being in the company of people who are armed, we can ourselves be target of an attack. And secondly, because it is very important for us to work independently. And so if we are in the company of people who have a position of control and authority, that may intimidate the people that we speak to, or may shape what they are able to tell us or not to tell us. So there are situations where we don't go to a place, even if we could go, but we don't go because we cannot work with the freedom that we need to have to work. And so, you know, those situations happen. Do those who are the subject of our investigation, the perpetrators, do they try to stop us from doing our work? Yes, they often do. That's why we try to keep a low profile. So often we do not announce our presence necessarily. And we try to work sort of under the radar in certain situations where that is possible. We have thankfully not been in a situation where somebody has killed one of our investigators, but unfortunately, in recent years, humanitarian personnel and journalists have been targeted more and more. You know, in the conflict in Ethiopia, humanitarian workers from Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and other organizations, both local and international staff, have been killed. And so it's a reality. It's a reality that fortunately has not affected us at Amnesty International for now, but we're very aware of it, and that's why we try to be very strict in our security risk assessment and in the way we operate. But ultimately, the best protection does not come by being in the company of armed people. The best protection comes from having a good knowledge of the environment in which we work and having good contact within civil society. That's what we try and do.
Hi, I have a question. First of all, very, very good, insightful lecture. Thank you for that. 2 questions. One of a more, I would say, personal logistical nature, and the other one more related to a particular mission on which you were, in which you were present. I talked to a former student of mine years ago. She works for the Red Cross. And she told me that they had quite a sort of almost like military-like training to test fitness, to be psychologically strong, and so because otherwise it's very difficult to survive in these kinds of situations. So listening to you, okay, you have a very interesting, I would say, private hobbies, but putting that aside, how do you prepare yourself in this regard? So how, in terms of fitness, in terms of just indeed psychological preparation, Because I would imagine that the work that you do and your colleagues are doing is to some extent comparable, if not even worse than those of people who work for the Red Cross. That would be one question. The other one is related to a particular action that you have taken part in, and that's Armenia, Stepanakert. I'm just wondering, I'm sure you have spoken, I mean, it was seen from the photographs, you have spoken to individuals who had been obviously in the middle of that attack. But I would also assume that, the government, either Armenia or Azerbaijan, would have wanted that you spoke also to the other parties. So I was just wondering if, while on ground, you were able to speak not just to the Armenian civilians, but to Azerbaijanis, and what sense did you get from interviews with both? Thank you.
So on your first question, in terms of, the training that you've described, it's called, hostile environment training, and we all do it. We do it at Amnesty International, our colleagues in other human rights and humanitarian organizations, UN as well as NGOs, journalists, we all do it. It's something that it's mandatory for people who deploy to the field, and it has been the case for quite a number of years. It wasn't the case when I started to work. This course didn't even exist, so it was much more a question of learning on the job. Now, thankfully, that is not the case. And it's pretty standard, so yeah, we all do that. Sometimes we are all at the same, courses, different organization and media outlets, and it's important preparation. We also, and that also includes sort of training, but also the availability of psychosocial support for people who experience not just first-hand trauma, not just for us who go to the field, but our colleagues who spend hours and hours and hours watching this sort of video. Vicarious trauma, secondary trauma is, can be as bad as first-hand trauma. So we at Amnesty International, again, like other organizations, also have the ability to receive to talk to people for debriefs, to get psychosocial support in different formats, in different language, because we have a very international staff all over the world. So that is very, very important because it is now very well recognized, the kind of post-traumatic stress that can come from having lived the situation, from having witnessed the situation firsthand, but also from having seen it from far. So yes, in that respect, we are well taken care of now. For your other question specifically about the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, so I went first to Azerbaijan and to the parts of Nagorno-Karabakh that had been recently recovered in the context of the conflict. I then immediately went from Azerbaijan, I went to Armenia by going a long way around because, a 2-hour car journey for me meant a flight from Baku to Istanbul, and then from Istanbul to Qatar, and then from Qatar to Armenia, because, that's the way that the political situation creates difficulties with communication and transport. So then I went to Armenia and to the parts of Nagorno-Karabakh that remain under Armenian control. And in all of those places, I spoke to people who had survived attacks, people who had witnessed attacks, relatives of people who were killed in the attacks, and I spoke to authorities, civilian and military authorities on both sides. It is a conflict, like many other conflicts, where you get two diametrically opposed narratives, where the ideological positions are very strong on both sides, and where both sides have very strong support from outside as well, both political support but also military support. And in a way, what we saw in the conflict in Azerbaijan, it was like the third example of a conflict that shows us the increased importance of Turkey as a power broker and as a player, politically and militarily, in conflict, because we've seen in Syria, the two key parties that are involved militarily and politically in the war and in the ceasefire agreements are Russia and Turkey. The same is true in the conflict in Libya, where we've seen Turkey and Russia being involved politically, militarily, including with the presence of mercenary. Turkey brought in Syrian mercenary. We've got the Wagner group that has been involved, the Russians. And then the same again in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, where we had Turkey supporting the Azerbaijani side and Russia supporting more the Armenian side, and then, coming to, again, a freeze of the conflict, not a resolution, but a freeze of the conflict, a ceasefire. So yes, absolutely. I mean, and that is what we try to do everywhere we go. We will speak to anybody who will speak to us. Obviously, sometimes some of the parties do not want to talk to us, but most of the time we do, because our job is to establish the facts. We don't have a position, but we need to hear people who have, very different and sometimes diametrically opposed positions. Ultimately, our analysis and our assessment is based on facts, but we still have to listen to the positions that everybody holds.
Thank you, Donatella. I'd like to use the opportunity to ask a question from Facebook. So it's, have you faced challenges in this position as a woman, access to certain stakeholders or similar, or perhaps, on the other hand, actually advantages? Thank you.
So I have worked primarily in the Middle East and Africa, but also in other parts of the world, but primarily in the Middle East and Africa. I have always found that being a woman has not been a disadvantage. Quite the contrary, it has been helpful in 2 or 3 ways. First of all, as a woman, I have access to the entirety of the population, women and men. So I have never faced a situation where men have not wanted to give their testimonies to me because I'm a woman, or have not wanted to show me their injuries, wherever those injuries may be, because I am a woman. Whereas for male investigators, they, in very conservative societies, they are often completely unable to talk to women in certain sectors of society. They are certainly not able to, women will not show their injuries in certain parts of the body to men. It's possible for me to go and knock on any doors, and if there are only women in the house, I can enter, and if there are only men, I can enter. Male investigators are, again, in conservative society, not able to go into a house where there are only women and there are no men. So that's one restriction. The other restriction for men that actually turns into an advantage for women is the fact that all the parties to the conflict, whether they are governments or armed groups, whether they are more conservative jihadi groups or more liberal, so to speak, but they have a common denominator, and they tend to look at women as not dangerous, so they don't suspect women of being spies, of being involved in supporting the enemy forces. And so I've been able to go through areas, to go through checkpoint, to cross front line very easily without being checked, or with very cursory checks, with nobody checking my bags, certainly nobody, checking what I had under my clothes, on my body. Whereas in situation where for men it would be completely impossible, because they would have to present identification documents at checkpoint, because they would be at risk of being arrested or potentially even killed. So I have not found disadvantages in that respect, and I have found that, you know, it can often be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Any other question here?
Thank you, Donatella, for this opportunity to be actually able to get a glimpse of what you've been doing for so many years. I too have perhaps two questions. One that relates to your work on the ground, so during the investigations, and the other one, what happens afterwards when you return to London. So with regards to the first one, you mentioned already that times are really difficult for civil society organizations, for media, with all these attacks. So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how you sort of introduce yourself. Do you mention that you work for Amnesty International, or is it better if you just come as a sort of independent researcher? And if you can tell us a little bit of perhaps a few examples of what is happening on the ground. And also in terms of working on the ground, do you use local interpreters, or how does that, I mean, of course we know that you speak so many languages, but still probably occasionally you do need interpreters. So how does that work, that you can get reliable interpreters that are not at risk themselves afterwards once you leave the country? And with regards to my second question, I wonder if you are ever called by any international actors to provide this evidence for perhaps political processes that we all expect. And again, is this, if you are called, is this a double-edged sword in a way that you may be, you may get too well known to sort of then deny you access to all these conflict zones? So if you can perhaps reflect a little bit about what happens then afterwards. Of course, we are all aware of the advocacy work by Amnesty International, but we would like, as students of international relations, of course, see also actions as you work on these acute sort of conflicts. Many thanks, and thanks again for your insights.
So, in terms of the way that we operate on the ground and the extent to which myself or my colleague introduce ourselves as being who we are, most of the time we do, to most people. Certainly to the people that we interview, like the victims, the survivors, the witnesses, absolutely. That's just an ethical consideration. We cannot secure an interview by pretending to be somebody else, whether we do that in person or whether we speak to people remotely. So that's sort of a non-negotiable. How we get there is where there is room for maneuver, and that is to say, as I already explained, there are situations, there are not many, but there are situations where we will be in a position to enter a country without, you know, without the permission of those who control that country or the territory. And then the same is true while we're inside. So do I advertise myself as being from Amnesty International when I go through some checkpoints of government forces or armed groups? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, sometimes I may even have a letter from the foreign ministry or something that facilitates my passage through the checkpoints. At other times, I will absolutely not say who I am, or I may not even be visibly recognizable as, you know, being an outsider. And so that very much depends on the situation. Again, because if those who control access to a particular area know who we are, they may deny passage, or worse, but also because, you know, it may then make it difficult for us to work, because our passage, if it's known through a particular checkpoint, may trigger surveillance mechanism, which make our work difficult or impossible, and which may then also constitute a risk for the people that we meet. So there are different ways of operating that depend entirely on the situation on the ground. Your second question was, I've just forgotten it, it was about, can you repeat? The second part of the question, it was access and... Yeah, no, but the second
interpreters, local interpreters, and then political
the
action
interpreters
afterwards.
thing, yeah. So I have worked mostly in countries where I don't need to go through translation, and that is certainly what I prefer. But there are other situations where, you know, and all the work that I've done on Ethiopia in the last year, and, you know, what you see on the screen is an example of work that I've been doing in interviewing women and girls who've been raped by fighters on both sides of the conflict, government forces and rebel forces, and, you know, speaking to doctors and medical personnel who provided medical treatment to them. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, I mean, a couple of the survivors spoke Arabic, but otherwise, yes, you know, I've had to speak to them via interpreters. And again, you know, the interpreters, we don't bring interpreters with us, so they're usually from the local community, and we choose them very carefully. And sometimes the interpreters are chosen by the people who give us the testimony. You know, they may say, look, you know, my cousin, or, you know, the midwives who provided medical treatment to me, you know, I'd rather speak, you know, I'd rather she translates. So, you know, depending on what the situation is, the quality of the interpretation, again, you know, it varies, and sometimes interviews take longer because, you know, we really need to make sure that we are getting the meaning of what, you know, people are telling us. But these are just, you know, the challenges of working in such situations. And your second questions was about, you know, whether we provide information to parties that may want to use it for political purpose and so on. Our information is generally made public, so we publish press releases, reports, briefings, videos, audio material, photographic evidence. All of that is public, and because it's public, it can be used by anyone, and it often is used by various parties for political purpose. And to give you a very concrete example, when we published this report last August, which was specifically about rape and sexual assaults of Tigrayan women by Ethiopian government forces and allied militias, the Ethiopian government published a response saying that our information was wrong, that we used flawed methodology, and that it was not credible, that we have been using sources that were manipulated, basically dismissing the information itself and the manner in which we gathered the information. And then a couple of weeks ago, we published a similar a press release on the same subject, but about Amhara women and girls who had been raped by Tigrayan fighters. And so the spokespersons of the Ethiopian government, who had dismissed our report when it was about government side, retweeted our press release and you know, praised it. While the Tigrayan rebel forces, who had praised this report because it was about the atrocities carried out by government forces, published a response saying that, you know, again, our report is flawed and the methodology and so on and so forth. And this happens all the time. Information published by anybody, once it's public, can be used and abused. Sometimes we are asked for information for legal proceedings, court proceedings, whether at a national level or local level. And much like media, Again, when the information has been made public, it's public and can be used and is used in a court of law. What we don't do very often is for us, or very, very, very rarely, is for us as investigators to go and testify. But that is very rarely required because the methodology of Amnesty International and the credibility of its information is pretty well established. So often the material that we have made public is enough for that purpose. In terms of, you know, when we become well known, then that may create challenges for access. I mean, myself and my colleagues do a lot of public work, media work, so we are well known, and if anybody Googles us, they will know exactly who we are and what we do. And that, of course, can also at times create problems, but we just have to deal with it. That's kind of, you know, what we can do, because we kind of we have to own our work, and we have to, you know, speak about our work, and to do so in public forum, and that means that it's known.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for Facebook in terms of dealing with. So I have a question posed whether you or your colleagues experience some post-traumatic stress, like similar to soldiers sometimes do experience this, because of your line of work.
Well, post-traumatic stress is something that is quite common amongst the kind of the wider community, which includes human rights workers, humanitarian workers, journalists, you know, anyone who operates in such conflicts. I think, you know, different situations affect people in different ways at different times. Sometimes, you know, we might be more sensitive to a situation, you know, because of our personal circumstances or not. But as I said, you know, we do have the availability of, I mean, obviously, you know, I've certainly had colleagues who have taken time off work because they were suffering from stress-related, from work-related stress situations, specifically due to the gruesome material that they had been confronted with. So yeah, I mean, I know colleagues within Amnesty, but also within other organization colleagues who are journalists who go through this. It is not so uncommon.
I have two questions, and one is that in contrary to some researchers that can have focus on a couple of countries or a region, you're working on crisis, so you have multiple acute situations happening simultaneously. So how does that, is that a challenge probably? I mean, you're finishing one report while you already planned the trip to the other country. And so I just wonder also in terms of maintaining the contacts, sources of information and so on, what kind of challenge this juggling actually with really high priority, high risk situations is. And then the other question is of a more practical nature. How do you, we've seen some photos, how does it look practically? Where do you stay in, you know, in bombarded towns where we don't see any whole houses, let alone, you know, accommodation sites? What do you eat and so on, just on a very practical level?
So, sorry, the first question. Yes, the sort of decision of priority. I mean, obviously, we are a number of people doing this work at Amnesty International, and so, you know, priorities are discussed, and you know, different people will work on different crises, and there is always more work than resources. But this is true also of non-crisis area of human rights work for Amnesty or for any other organization. So that's just a challenge that we have to deal with. It is, of course, a bit more complicated to work on many different situations and situations that keep reoccurring in some cases. Like, I first worked in Iraq 20 years ago, and then since then there have been several ups and downs in the intensity of the conflict, and I've gone back several times to work in different parts of the country on different issues. The same is true for Syria and for a number of other countries. So sometimes, maintaining the contacts, you cannot maintain contact with everybody, but I'm still in contact with people that I met in certain conflict where I worked, more than 20 years ago. And I may, even cases where I haven't gone back. Yeah, it is laborious, but yeah, there isn't really a magic solution to that other than, trying to keep on top of things. Again, I think that in recent years, with the advent of social media, and especially with the advent of better connectivity, because, 15 years ago, there were a lot of places where, people didn't have mobile phone, like internet was rarely available. It's still the case now in some places, especially for people who live in rural areas, away from the capital, in situation where, due to conflict, like, now in Ethiopia, the parts of the countries that are affected by conflict, there is no internet or phone in a lot of them. So the physical challenge of maintaining contact is today much improved by the fact that, people are on social media. And so the way to keep in touch with people that, maybe I came across 20 years ago in some war zones, and with whom I, maybe lost contact, and I find them through Facebook or Instagram. So there are now ways of keeping contact in a, let's say, less labor-intensive way. You don't always have to pick up the phone and have a conversation to keep in contact, because people are better connected in the places where they are. In terms of the practicality of where it's possible to stay, where to sleep and what to eat, it varies enormously. There are places where, yeah, I sleep in a tent and I bring food with me because there is really very little available locally. I'm thinking, for example, refugee camps, IDP camps in South Sudan, and places like that where there is very little available in those locations. And you also, I certainly don't want to take what's available there if I can, bring it with me. So that. Other situation where, yeah, you can also sleep in a half-destroyed building. You can also put a tent inside a half-destroyed building and sleep there. It's possible to sleep in a vehicle. It's possible to sleep in people's houses, because either there are no hotels, or if it's in a situation where it's not possible to be visible, even if there are hotels, it's not possible to go and check into a hotel. So let's say that the accommodation and food situation is not often Michelin star during these trips. But yeah, it's certainly possible to survive. We don't go for, very, very long period of time, so it's manageable. I guess that the biggest challenge for me is not really where I can sleep or what I can eat. You can have a very good meal on a can of peas, for example, and some bread and biscuits. It's how can I keep my equipment safe? How can I charge my equipment so that I have, working sat phone, working laptop, enough battery in the video camera or in the camera? How can I keep my equipment safe from dust and from rain when it's the rainy season and it's pouring with rain and everything is soaked? Even if you are soaked, your camera cannot be soaked. You need to find ways with plastic bags and stuff to keep it dry. So yeah, and how can I get around? Because one of the first casualties in situations of war and conflict is fuel, and getting around is necessary. And so finding a vehicle that works and fuel that is not mixed with water and other things that then causes problem for the engine. Those practical problems are kind of like more central than the food and the sleep that can be managed.
Thank you. Is there any final questions, perhaps, because we kind of near the time that was allocated to us? Anyone? Then I will just give the mic back to our director.
Well, if there are no more questions, I will thank again to Donatella. We appreciate to have really the opportunity to hear firsthand how the research work happens in the what are the really most high-risk situations. And really thank you for your time and effort to come here and speak to us. Thank you.